Good morning, guys. This is part 2 when OBD2 fails. Runs rough, no code set. So we're going to be looking at the Infinity today. We were looking at the Mustang in part 1. That noise is Krieger. And there is Ruka hanging out on her bed this morning. Nice, cold, frosty October morning. Unfortunately, I don't have any updates for the engine on the 69 Ford. It's parked out back. We do have a lot of engine parts scattered. You'll notice my toolbox is gone. I got that dropped off at the shop yesterday. I picked up a new job in the aftermarket or in an independent shop. Starting on Monday, should be pretty good. Hopefully I'll be able to get a couple of videos there. They do have phone limitations, so I might not be able to send you guys a whole lot. So I'm gonna try to keep this brief. We have a whole lot of information to go over here today. We're mostly gonna be going over live data, what to be looking for, obvious things to look at. We're gonna pop the hood of this, give you kind of an idea of what's going on under the hood of this Infinity. So give me just a second here while I get the hood prop up. There we go. Hey, look at that, turn the phone sideways too. So this is our air intake. You can see it's pulling air through here. This one we can actually see the filter, and if I had my flashlight with me, which I don't, we can see that that filter is fairly plugged up. Very obvious thing that we can test and check to see what's going on. Now this is our mass airflow sensors I mentioned in the last one. We simply have 2, and of course these are security torques because they wanted to be jerks. This is the Maf sensor. Always check the wiring, make sure that we're not all torn up. Not shredded anywhere, no wires are pinched. We don't have any obvious problems here at the connector. You can see this connector has been removed before. Checking these intake tubings are very common to tear on the Nissans and Infinities. You can actually see, hey, look at that, this one's cracking, this one needs to be replaced. I have already replaced the upper boot up here. That one was torn when I bought it, was able to replace that, was able to pick up quite a bit of power and fuel efficiency as well. That's generally all that we're going to look at here very briefly under the hood of this one. We could pull the engine hood off, inspect more of the intake, see what's going on, ignition connectors, and whatnot. But the majority of this film is going to be for live data. Okay, so as you can see, this car was run a little bit. I tried to make this video, it ended up cutting off on me, ran it too long, so we're going to try to make this a little bit briefer. Deleted some data out of the phone, hopefully you get a little bit more. So we've got the key turned on, the engine is not running. You can see we do have the check engine light is coming on as it should, the battery light is on as it should, and the oil pressure light is on as it should. You can see we got a door open, we got a brake light that's on even though we're not on the brakes. This is basically just a simple bulb check. So what we're going to do is see and make sure that all our bulbs are coming on, VDC slip, and they should AT check. Everything's going off the way that it should. So we've got this scanner connected. This is a very cheap low-end scanner. I wanted to use this one instead of my nice Autel today to kind of give you an idea what you're going to be looking at if you were to take it to O'Reilly or if you have your own cheap scan tool like this. Now, this is very limited in what it can do. We'll check codes. Sometimes these will have codes set. Even though it says no code stored, it will set permanent DTCs and other DTCs, temporary pending codes that won't show up as a set DTC. We can erase codes, emission readiness. This will actually go through and tell us what monitors have been completed. So as of right now, everything is completed normally. This thing makes me want to throw it against the wall. It beeps and then it takes forever to change down. But you can see that everything has completed. This one is saying EGR and or variable valve timing is not applicable. That is incorrect. This does not have an EGR system, but it does have variable valve timing, which can perform an EGR function, meaning intake and exhaust valves have what's called overlap, and so they'll both temporarily be open at the same time to allow reversion air to come back up the exhaust system into the engine, which is why on the last video we were so adamant about not having any exhaust leaks within about 3 feet of that downstream exhaust sensor. Can't have any exhaust leaks up above that. Once it's about 2 to 3 feet behind the rear oxygen sensor, it's not going to skew readings too significantly to cause any problems. So we're going to pop out of that, get into some live data here. This does have some other functions here. Can show us freeze frame data, which will give you an idea if it did set a code. However, that is not what this video is about. You can see it does have some different information in here, some tests that you can run. I don't trust anything really that comes out of this, even a lot of the live data. So we're going to look at every graphic, every item. This will do some graphing. The graphing is absolute garbage. it sent me down a lot of false positives saying that, hey, a sensor's dropping out, when actually it wasn't dropping out. It was just this cheap scan tool temporary losing signal and saying that the voltage went from, 2.5 volts or whatever it was and dropped out, when really it didn't drop out. It was just the sensor or just this scanner that actually had issues. So before we get into much of that, so this is part 2, live data. We're just going to be using some general logic here, temperatures, and when sensors fail within parameters. So that's where we're going to be getting started. So a lot of the times the engine can't sense a failure if the temperature sensor has failed within parameters. So let's say the engine coolant temperature is stuck here, or the sensor is only reading 141 degrees Fahrenheit. But because it's within parameters, it has failed and stuck at that temperature. A lot of the times ECM doesn't see a fault. It'll throw a, like we didn't warm up fast enough code, like a P0124 or a P0125, I believe is what they were, for a thermostat code, meaning the engine's not warming up fast enough, and that very well could be the issue. So just some simple live data and some simple logic looking at some of this stuff. You can see we have no load value because we are not running, and we are currently in open loop. So I'm going to go ahead and kick this over so we can look at some of this live data. You can see we are still in open loop, and that is because we are not quite warmed up yet. Once we get up into a lot better temperature, it's going to give us a little bit of a better idea. You can see we are sitting here at idle. The AC is turned off. You can see we don't have a light there. The AC is turned off. The compressor is not running. And you can see we are all the way at 25%. Hey, look at that. We have already switched to closed loop fueling, which means that the engine is now reading oxygen sensors. It's reading the Maf sensors. It's not running on pre-programmed data in order to operate. It's actually reading the sensors and responding. You'll notice that the engine RPM is down there a little bit, and that's where these infinities will reside when they're running right, is they will actually idle very, very low. You can see the engine coolant temperature is rising. We are up to 152 degrees now. It is steadily rising as it goes. You can see as I accelerate, you can see that calculated load value got way up there. And you can see that as I accelerate, it switches from closed loop to open loop. And the more rapidly you accelerate, the more often it's going to do it. You can actually hear the engine rev up and die off before this scan tool actually even registered it. So sometimes these scan tools can be such garbage that they'll actually give you a false positive. So engine coolant temperature is rising. It's about where it should be. Now, short-term, long-term fuel trims. I'm going to try to be very brief with this. There's a lot of information that you can glean from this. For the most part, don't pay too much attention to the short-term fuel trims. So these are very rapid, very quick adjustments that are done to the air-fuel ratio that the ECM is monitoring. This is basically, the short-term fuel trims are basically the ECM's testing. So let's try another 5% fueling here at this particular RPM. Adds 5% fuel, and then it's monitoring the oxygen sensors to see what the correction was, what it did. It says, well, 5% was a little too high. You know what, let's try 3.1%. And so then it tries 3.1%, monitors the oxygen sensors, say, okay, well, typically for bank 1, adding about 4% fuel seems to keep us where we want, and so it will actually save that short-term fuel trim data and store it as long-term fuel trim data. So now, at a perfect idle, no acceleration, you can see that the long-term fuel trim for bank 1 is sitting at 3.9%, where the long-term fuel trim down here for bank 2 is sitting at 0%. These are actually incredible good readings. Generally up till about 2010, you shouldn't see anything above about 15% correction. Anything above about 10% correction, in my opinion, is something that's going to need to be addressed, but it's not necessarily the end of the world. Anything over 15% is going to throw lean codes or rich codes, depending on which way it is, whether it's cutting fuel or adding fuel. These are very easy to read. If it's a positive number, it's adding fuel. If it's a negative number, it's cutting fuel. So right now, long-term fuel trim bank 1, we are adding about 4% fuel. Not bad. So we are going to accelerate this up to about 1500 RPM. You're going to see that long-term fuel trim start changing. You can see we're still under 10%. There's absolutely no issue with that. But if you were starting to accelerate up and seeing this start to go absolutely mad, adding all kinds of fuel, we know that we are running lean on bank 1. Especially comparing bank 1 to bank 2. You see we're at 8.6, 7.8. We are a little bit more lean on bank 1 than bank 2, but again, we are not too far out of parameters. I'm not too concerned with that. You'll notice the short-term fuel trims are switching around a lot more rapidly than these long-terms, and that's because these are doing immediate corrections, where these are saved long-term corrections. So if you clear the codes on this or disconnect the battery, you're going to lose this long-term fuel trim data. So if you've already cleared codes, even though it didn't have any, you can skew these readings pretty significantly. So we're going to continue working down. If this scan tool ever decides to show me, there it is. So you can see engine RPM here. This is what the sensors, or what the engine, the ECM is seeing. This is what the gauge is giving me, which looks about 250. So it looks like that gauge is reading a little bit low compared to what this is reading. This is reading about 660. That is pretty normal on these Infinities to run at that low of an idle RPM, primarily for fuel efficiency and for vibration control. Obviously the vehicle's not moving. You can see the ignition timing. Now at idle, this should stay pretty well steady. If you see this jumping around like crazy at idle, that's because it is using the spark to try to correct either a fuel issue, either too much fuel, not enough fuel, or too much air and not enough air, typically from a skewed Maf sensor, bad injectors. That will kind of cause this ignition timing to jump around. Now, intake air temperature sensor, this is generally something I like to look at on a cold engine, see about where it's reading. We're reading about 66 degrees. Ambient temperature is currently at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Assuming that sensor is correct, it's always good to have your own gauge. And just your general sense of the temperature will give you, kind of let you know what that's about. Now, with the hood shut on and driving around, you will see a lot higher temperatures than what the ambient is, and that's because that intake air temperature sensor is affected by the engine temperature inside of the engine bay, if that makes sense. So if the engine's nice and hot, that temperature is going to translate into the intake ducting, and it's going to warm up that intake air charge temperature as it's coming into the engine. So we are reading higher than the ambient temperature, completely normal. However, if we were reading significantly below ambient temperature, so we're 50 degrees right now, and this we're reading something like 20 degrees or 30 degrees, we know we have an issue with that intake air temperature sensor. It very well could be just a bug stuck on the sensor, could be a number of different things. Mass airflow rate, this can be, there are specifications for this. This one is reading in pounds per minute. You might have to convert it from whatever all data or whatever you're using as a specification for what this should be seeing at about idle. And you will see that this does change. And as we accelerate here just a little bit, you can see just how slowly this scan tool is actually reading that Maf sensor, and that's because of the logic inside of this. This is a very cheap, poor unit. Not really recommended for diagnostics, but it can be beneficial. So, absolute throttle position, this is not your throttle position sensor. This is the corrected absolute throttle position, meaning that, yes, you are only at, let's say an 8th throttle. You can see it's coming up a little bit, but because there's no load on the engine, it's not much of a throttle. And then as we accelerate it a little bit, we're getting up almost 3,500 RPM, and we barely saw 30% absolute throttle. That's because we're not moving. Oxygen sensor output voltage. There are parameters for this of about where it should be riding at. That can give you some information. Let's see if this thing wants to scroll down for us. Short-term fuel trims, oxygen sensors. Again, we're looking at voltages, nothing too crazy there. And that's it. That's really all that this one really gives us, which is very unfortunate. We have engine coolant temperature, we have intake air temperature sensor, we have Maf sensor, oxygen sensors. What we don't have is camshaft timing. We don't have, there's a lot of information that is missing out of this one. Cylinder head temperature. Just a pile of information that this absolute garbage is just not giving us the information that we need. So when OBD2 fails, temperatures, for example, we're just going to use some very general logic. So engine coolant temperature, we really shouldn't see anything above about 220 degrees Fahrenheit. Operating temperatures are typically anywhere from 160 on something older, all the way up to 190 to 220 are considered normal operating temperatures for different vehicles. It just depends on what particular vehicle you are. This one, I do believe this Infiniti likes to ride around 205, 210. A lot of the newer cars are running as hot as 220, 225 normally. That's just the way that they run. But a lot better emissions that way, a lot better power, a lot better performance. However, general logic can help you out a lot. So one of the big things that will cause a no code to set and a drivability issue is when a sensor fails within parameters. An excellent example of that, my nephew had an Acura RSX, absolutely running like crap, couldn't figure out what was going on with it. I was able to hook up a scan tool to it, drove it around a little bit with him, found that the intake air temperature reading was reading way out of whack, like 150, 160 degrees. The fueling was completely out of whack because of it. And what it ended up being was his intake air temperature sensor. Somebody had installed a cold air intake, and that temperature sensor had fallen out of the intake. They tried to electrical tape it up to get it to fit, and it had actually fallen out, and so it was actually reading the hot temperature coming off of the exhaust manifold. It didn't melt the sensor, thank goodness, but it was reading that hot exhaust manifold temperature and not reading the actual air coming into the engine. Was not throwing any codes for the intake air temperature sensor, even though that is what is wrong. Just simple general logic and knowing that the temperature shouldn't be that high on the intake was enough for me to determine that we had that problem. Now, typically what you'll see, so the first example I've got here is a throttle position sensor. Now this is just a rheostat, meaning that as that sensor opens, the voltage is going to increase. Meaning that when it's closed, it's going to have a high resistance, and then as that throttle opens, it's going to vary the resistance coming through that sensor, and it's going to read in different voltages. Now, this is very easy to determine. You want to look at the throttle position sensor in your live data, and you're going to have key on, engine off, and you are going to very slowly step on the throttle, and it should very continuously go from 0 volts all the way up to 4.8 up to 5 volts. Typically, you should not see 5 volts. That's kind of a fail-safe. If you're seeing 5 volts, generally that is an issue, especially on something that is a rheostat, like a fuel level sensor, a number of other position sensors, intake manifold runner control position sensors, that kind of thing. You shouldn't see anything more than about 5 volts, and it should be a very, very steady, nice, easy, smooth transition all the way up as you slowly step on that gas pedal, and it should respond as you are stepping on that gas pedal. That voltage should vary. If it doesn't, and it goes from, let's say, half a volt, 1 volt, 2 volts slowly, and then it jumps to 4.8 volts and then drops back off to 3.2 volts and then back to 2 volts and then all the way up to 4.8, you know you've got an issue right here with that throttle position sensor. Very simple to determine, very simple to watch. It will never throw a code though, because it has failed within parameters. Now, sometimes the engine can detect the logic failure that, hey, he was slowly accelerating, especially on something that has a throttle position sensor or that has an accelerator pedal position sensor, which this Infiniti does. That gas pedal is not hooked to the throttle. It is all controlled by wires. This is simply just a sensor, a rheostat under your foot that is not connected to the engine in any way, shape, or form. It is all done electronically. This just sends an electric signal to the ECM that the ECM then reads and interprets. So another one is a temperature sensor. Typically, as the voltage increases, the temperature will also increase. Unless it's a negative coefficient, then it will actually go the other direction. But generally, as the temperature increases, you should see voltage increase. These temperature sensors are very easy to diagnose. A simple, one of those infrared little gun temperature sensors pointed right at the sensor will tell you the approximate temperature sensor, and then that should be somewhere close within parameters. Maf sensors. I'm trying to be quick. This video is about to cut me off. So this is what a MAF curve should look like as you accelerate, and as that hot wire produces more and more and more voltage, the pounds per minute are also increasing at the same time. Now, this is a saved data. This is a saved calibration that's actually stored in the ECM. This can be tuned, but this is what that mass airflow sensor. So as more air is coming by, if it is a Hertz sensor, which is more the new style, which this Infiniti does not have. The newer Nissans do. It will read in hertz. So anywhere around idle should be around 100. Wide open throttle at a high load should be reading somewhere in the ballpark. Now that your vehicle is going to have its own specifications. Now, older Nissans like this one, or this older Infiniti, is going to read in volts. 0 to 5 volts, the more voltage, the more air is coming into the engine. As that air increases, the more fuel that the engine is going to be adding in order to compensate for that. Now, fuel pump duty cycle, this will really help with fuel pressure. So let's say we have 20 psi, supposed to have 40 psi. You should not ever exceed 80 to 85% duty cycle. And that is kind of a fail-safe parameter, kind of gives you a little bit extra. And so if you've got 20% or 20 psi fuel pressure, and this fuel pump duty cycle is maxed out 80, 95, or 100%, and you've only got 20 psi, more than likely you've got a failing fuel pump. Could be an electrical issue to the fuel pump, but you can see simply by looking at the fuel pump duty cycle, and if the duty cycle is only reading about 20%, and you've only got 20 psi, but you need 40%, something else is going on. But this can kind of give you a general idea of what that fuel pump is trying to do. So if it's got it cranked all the way up here 85, 90%, and you're only getting 50% of your fuel pressure that you should see, you know that you've got a fuel pump issue. Could be a restriction, could be a plugged fuel filter. Generally it is a failing pump when it's sending that kind of voltage and it's still not getting the pressures where it needs to. Obviously replace the fuel filter first before replacing the pump. Hopefully I didn't burn through all this too fast. This video, like I said, is about to cut me off. Any questions? If you guys need any help, please leave it in the comment section. I will get back to you as soon as I can. I love helping people out, love helping cars out, trying to get them back on the road again, especially when you get into a nightmare situation where your diagnostic system on the car has left you in the dirt, left you in the dust. So hopefully this helps you guys out. Have an excellent day. And watch for part 3. Might be a couple of months before it comes out. Part 1 didn't seem to be very popular. I'm hoping that somewhere down the road, someone's going to find this video and it's absolutely going to help them out and educate them. So have a good one, you guys.